GM, welcome to another Touchgrass podcast episode. Today I'm joined by Mr. King as part of our ongoing VC series on the show. Just for context for everyone, there's been a lot of rumors on crypto Twitter about, crypto VCs not investing or shying away or pivoting to AI. Jonathan's probably one of the first investors I followed when I got into the space back in 2022. He's definitely one of the only investors who cared about posting on LinkedIn back in the day, which was where I lived. Sort of my naive days back in the day. This is like a very full circle moment for me. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. Yeah, that takes me back. My background right before Coinbase Ventures, I was actually working at Microsoft, so I was very active on LinkedIn and not
Yeah,
so much on crypto Twitter, but now kind of enjoying both worlds. So thank you for having me.
awesome. I think that segues perfectly. Talk to us about the transition from like Microsoft into the crypto VC side. Any brief intro for our audience is very helpful content.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the Coinbase Ventures team 4 years ago. I now lead the investments team, but previously my background is actually in product and engineering. So I used to work at Microsoft, and then before that, I was in the energy industry. And so it was like roughly when I was in the energy industry, probably like 2016, 2017. That's really when I started to get like kind of crypto blockchain pilled. And that was mostly due to like at that time, like the hype around, crypto and blockchain was really around enterprise blockchain use cases, right? And like, the Internet of Things and this whole like concept around connecting machines and how do you verify data and like make that, more transparent through like these public ledgers. So I've been following the space for some time. I continued through like my product career within like the big tech industry, but always had this pull to join crypto at some point. And it just so happened that, Coinbase Ventures was looking for an investor with a more technical background. And yeah, I had the pleasure of joining May 2022. So I guess like maybe in 2 weeks actually marks my 4-year anniversary, and it's certainly been an incredible journey, incredible ride.
Awesome. Before we get more deep into sort of the ride, 4 years at Coinbase Ventures, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of stories that we can unfold on this pod. Can you, just for background context, can you talk a little bit about the stage at which Coinbase Venture invests in and sort of the typical check size that you guys prefer to deploy?
Yeah, so Coinbase Ventures, we are stage agnostic, but I will say that like our sweet spot is typically like seed and Series A. We are writing checks on average between $1 to $5 million, and even though yes, technically we are like a corporate venture firm, we actually optimize for financial returns. I would say 80 to 90% of the deals that we do in a given year are kind of driving to a financial outcome for Coinbase and our shareholders, and then 10 to 20% roughly are more strategic, right? Where there's probably some more like a partnership outcome that we're trying to drive towards, kind of amplifying like our existing product suites within Coinbase.
That makes sense. And then sort of, Jonathan, talk to us a little bit about, we'll obviously talk about the early days. I do want to
Mhm.
pick your brains on 2022, 2023, very interesting time. A lot of talk on crypto Twitter about 2022 and 2023 being symbolic to what 2026 right now is sort of portraying. But what is the current sort of fund mandate or thesis? Like, what are you guys focusing on? What are some verticals that you're really, really excited about?
Yeah, so in terms of like our fund thesis, it certainly has evolved over time. And so, I would say back in like 2022, coming out of like the 2021 like kind of bull market, we were still, in a sense, still seeding the ecosystem. So seeing like a lot of different projects, we were writing smaller checks at the time, and kind of seeing what is going to work and what is going to emerge. Obviously, 2022, 2023 was an interesting time in the bear market, but I actually feel like we made some of our best investments during like that first bear. And that's mainly because, we want to show up where the builders are showing up, and where those builders have like the highest conviction. That's where we want to spend like our nights and weekends from the investment angle. And so, fast forward to today, I would say that we're, a little bit more concentrated, and concentrated in the sense that, very thematic driven in terms of our investment approach. And like some of the themes that, we continue to double down into would be stablecoins and payments. Of course, that's probably like our bread and butter, mostly from, if you look at like the stablecoin market, there's approximately been 33 trillion in transactions last year. We've just crossed 26 and a half within the last 3 months. So there's a lot of activity as we see more institutional adoption. And so, we are, kind of crossing the boundaries into more traditional fintech spaces where they're starting to adopt stablecoins. So it's kind of really broadening the aperture for, how we can invest in that sector more broadly. An area that's like near and dear to my heart is really like this convergence of crypto and AI, and we've been investing against that thesis over the last 2 years. Most recently, that is now dovetail into, I would say, like agentic commerce, and you probably see some of the things that Coinbase is doing around X402. And we believe in this future where if there are going to be millions upon or maybe billions of like these smart machines, then these machines need a machine native form of payment, right? And we think that's going to happen through stablecoins, and so we want to kind of build that payment protocol. And then lastly, I would say, we spent a lot of time. We put out like this 2026 request for startups back in December, and we've been spending a lot of time kind of thinking about like more just trading, right? And kind of like specialized exchanges and trading terminals, whether that's through prediction market aggregators, thinking about the different like assets that can be asset classes that can be introduced through perps and like those type of exchanges. So I would say those are like the three verticals that we continue to kind of focus on. But mostly we're still like a generalist firm as long as there's a crypto blockchain component, but we try to hone in on those three areas in terms of where we're sizing up our conviction.
That makes sense. And two follow-up questions on that.
Mhm.
On the trading terminal side, whenever I talk to a lot of VCs with the current sort of existing players out in the market, a lot of those VCs are very hesitant to invest into new trading terminals or new trading options, or not options, like more variety.
Mhm.
In terms, is that something that you would say is like a contrarian bet for the Coinbase Ventures team, where you believe that there is still innovation to be had within the trading space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that there's still innovation to be had. I think right now you are seeing like a market where it is becoming somewhat saturated, but I do think there are like very strong teams that come from like kind of trading or quantitative backgrounds that are building like unique products for what we kind of call like this prosumer or pro trader type of bucket. And what I like about like the kind of like these specialized exchanges and trading terminals is that they have very proven business models, right? In terms of like how they can scale. And so those teams that are able to get distribution early on, I think that they're going to do well long term. But it will be interesting to see how that space around trading continues to evolve. But that's where we're seeing like a line share of activity, right? Between everything you see on the perp side to now like on the stablecoin side. And like those are the two areas where I'm seeing the most activity from like a builder interest perspective.
That makes sense. And on like the stablecoin and payment sort of
Mhm.
angle, like what I've through our conversations with a lot of VCs, we've started to realize a pattern of like, if you look back to DeFi summer, if you look back at a
Mhm.
traditional DeFi protocol and you look at some of the Web 2.5 categories, what they like to call it, type of businesses with sort of incumbents, the stablecoin narrative, the payments narrative, this is like a world apart in terms of how you evaluate both businesses. Is that
Mhm.
something that you guys have experienced at Coinbase Ventures, where evaluating the stablecoin or payments sort of crypto protocol is very different from what we used to do back in the day? And can you talk a little bit about that framework, if so?
Yeah, it is. It is actually different, and the reason that it's different is like if you think about like DeFi protocols, like the KPIs that you're measuring are different, right? So on the DeFi side, you're thinking about things around okay, transaction volume, for example. You're thinking about like kind of lending risks and like a multitude of other factors. TBL as like kind of like a somewhat of a leading indicator. Whereas on stablecoins, you get a mix. Yeah, yes, we kind of say TPV, so total payments volume. So that is like transactional in nature. But also a lot of these stablecoin businesses are like SaaS businesses, right? So now we're thinking about things around ARR to net dollar retention to looking at churn rates, et cetera. So it kind of puts on a different hat. You're looking at this more from like an equity outcome versus more of like a protocol or token outcome. So you kind of look at the businesses a little bit differently. And like today, to your point, you're seeing more traditional fintechs that are well established, ARR generating businesses. And, they're kind of getting more into like, I would say, growth stage investing in a sense by introducing like stable coins for like their future, prospects and go forward business model. So it's an interesting dynamic in terms of like how we're starting to underwrite these businesses that have more of like an equity forward approach.
That makes sense. And I would assume that also changes how you evaluate the founder in particular. Like, I would assume evaluating the founder of a DeFi protocol and evaluating the founder of sort of a payments protocol is completely different. Is there sort of some certain traits that you've noticed that a DeFi protocol founder might not have that a payments protocol founder definitely needs?
Yeah, so I think like, in the payment side, obviously it's more institutional kind of like focus and driven and like the type of clients that you're working with. So, jokingly I'll say like, on the payment side, I have yet to get like an anonymous team come to pitch me versus on the DeFi on-chain native side that happens, still quite often. Although like now it's like people are starting to dox and they want to put their face attached to the business. So yeah, that is the main thing. So we're kind of looking at like the credibility of the founder. We can do like much deeper like reference checks and kind of looking into their background to make sure that they have like what we like to see as like founder market fit on that side. And then some of that also applies to the DeFi side. But yes, like there's like a certain aspect of like regulatory aspects to wanting to garner institutional adoption, so founder credibility becomes of the utmost importance, especially on like kind of like the payments and stablecoin sector.
That makes sense. Jonathan, take me back to like 2022.
Mhm.
I think it's a very interesting time, and I would assume like a lot of the bets that you guys took in 2022 and 2023, like with the fund cycle sort of in mind, those bets must now be in fruition where you're like, okay, this is a clear winner. Talk to us about the evolution of crypto VCs since that time, and go ahead and definitely name some winners that the Coinbase team is very proud of owning.
Yeah, so 2022 was an interesting time for me. I think like that was the time again. I'm super excited. Okay, I'm joining crypto full time. That's been a dream come true. And we go immediately into the depths of a bear market. And so people looking around like, hey, are you okay? Like, did you make the right decision? And I can without a doubt say that I did. And the reason for it is because the one thing I love about Coinbase Ventures is that, we continue to invest in throughout all market cycles, like I mentioned, right? So if the builders are showing up and they continue to keep their heads down despite what's happening in the market, they have that conviction. We want to partner alongside them and support them on that journey ahead. And so, that led to like our investments into Bridge and BVNK on like the stablecoin side. That led to, early investments into Solana, for example, right? Solana in 2023. So the squads and the Caminos of the world. And so again, just like a very exciting time. And we kind of like we pattern match and we're seeing some of those same opportunities today, right? Well, like even though like I would say some of the fundraising rounds are taking a little bit longer to come together, we're being very patient and we're going after like those like top teams that are doing the same thing. They're building that conviction. They're where are they spending their nights and weekends? And we want to show up and be right alongside them to make those bets as well.
That makes sense. Do you have any thoughts on why it's taking longer to sort of put rounds together right now? Like, is this a market thing? Is it actually that VCs are not investing right now? Like, do you have like a pulse on that?
Yeah, I would say it's more so like the market, right? Anytime like there's uncertainty on the market for any capital allocator across any asset class, like people move into periods of, I would say, patient capital in a sense, and you're waiting for like a multitude of factors to play out, or perhaps like folks are hedging their bets. And so, for us, I always say like for us, it's always been business as usual, right? My like in these type of markets, my days don't change. I still have like a consistent flow of like back to back calls with founders and doing due diligence activities in the evenings. And so again, we're trying to support the founders through this journey as they're kind of like keeping their heads down and like they're building that conviction. We want to be right there with them.
That makes sense. And then, Jonathan, during like, it's obviously very common now for funds to sort of think about pivoting to AI. And I talked to so many VCs who are now thinking about it. Uh, Obviously, like in the 2022 era, there are some historic funds that have made AI investments back
Mhm.
in the day. Uh, I'm curious, like throughout the 4 years you've been at Coinbase Ventures, has this ever become a topic? Like, hey, maybe we start thinking about this, or we compete on these deals as well.
No, like I wouldn't say like, an entire pivot into AI has ever been a topic for us. For us, we see AI as just being very complementary to, how we're investing and both from like, how we use AI for, kind of making us more efficient as an organization, as an investment team. And then also looking at like these kind of intersection points between crypto and AI. And like I mentioned earlier, some of the things we're seeing around X402, Coinbase's payment protocol, there's a lot of builder interest, right? And we're continuing to invest invest on top of X402. And so that's where we're going to continue to place our bets. Like Coinbase Ventures will always be a crypto native, crypto forward, crypto first fund. But we're also going to broaden the aperture a little bit and look at like some of these emerging AI opportunities where there is like a very strong kind of like crypto intersection that we can explore and further develop.
That makes sense. And then obviously with like the Coinbase team being so heavily invested in building their own products, like there's a number of different products in the suite right now. And obviously the number has expanded since 2022. As Coinbase gets more deeply invested into a lot of these different product suites, does that influence the Coinbase Ventures sort of funding appetite or the way that you guys think about investing? Is that complementary in a way because the end goal is to sort of increase Coinbase's end output?
Yeah, so it's a really great question because and one of the things I love about Coinbase Ventures and talking about like maybe an early story is that Brian and our exec team have always been supportive of, hey, if you see the best founders out in the ecosystem, like go invest in them, irrespective of what Coinbase might be building behind the scenes, right? And so that's always been our approach, right? Like I said, like we lead with the mindset that we want to drive a financial return first for the company, but also there will be opportunities for strategic deals, right? And so, a great example of that, like our Coinbase retail exchange and the partnership that we did with Morpho, which was both an investment plus a partnership on kind of launching this new retail lend and borrow products. And so I think that we'll see more opportunities like that as like Coinbase is introducing more on-chain native products into the fold, into like our retail surface areas, and kind of using ventures as, okay, you guys are boosting the ground, you're seeing the cutting edge, how can we surface the relevant insights that can inform like our product strategies. But overall, like we have a very open, very wide investment approach, and great to have like that kind of like push from Brian and the exec team for sure.
Yeah, and talking about the Coinbase team and support from Brian, like we've had a lot of ex Coinbase employees, or well,
Mhm.
ex Coinbase employees that have now become Coinbase employees back again after the acquisition. Can you talk a little bit about Coinbase culture? What is the culture that drives so many of these founders to become successful and then come back, join Coinbase? Is that also like a vector in your database of like, hey, if this person ends up starting a company, we'll just invest? Like, how does that work internally?
Yeah, so I'll kind of characterize that and say, Coinbase is a founder factory, right? And so we are very, very supportive of our Coinbase alums that have gone off and built like some amazing companies, right, across like a plethora of different like sectors. And then we always see like the boomerang approaches to founders, whether that's through M&A or they're just returning back to Coinbase. And so it really just comes from the DNA. It's led by Brian at the top, himself being a founder. This is still a founder-led company. And so that startup DNA is still here, right? And that's why across every org within Coinbase, even in ventures, we move with efficiency, right? We our values around like being like efficient execution and acting like an owner, that's embedded into like who we are and how we operate. And so, it doesn't surprise me that we have a lot of alums that go off to be very talented founders, and also, some of them returning as well.
Yeah, and I can sort of name drop some of these so that we sort of build up the story.
Mhm.
So Mert was a ex Coinbase employee.
Yep.
We had Dan from Farcaster, Nick Tomatino from One Confirmation as well, Olaf from Polychain. We had Teddy from Plume. We had Antonia from DYDX and the Magic Eden
Mhm.
founders as well. Like I think the list just goes on and on. The
Zach
Zora founders.
Abrams from Bridge. Yep.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly, exactly. Like there's just
Mhm.
so many, and it's always interesting. Like whenever we get a person that's worked at Coinbase, like we always ask this question, and it just turns into like this amazing conversation about how Brian's been able to create this culture of like, hey, if you want to do
Mhm.
your own thing, like, I will support it, and do whatever is best for you, and it sort of just blossoms that way. And it always, like, it's funny or not, like it always ends up becoming net positive for Coinbase in one way or the another because
Absolutely.
they sort of come back and contribute back to the ecosystem as well. Jonathan, this has been amazing. I know we're getting closer to time. I do have a few final questions.
Sure.
Um, Apart from the fund mandate, you must be looking at a lot of deals across. There must be some sort of verticals that are smaller for the Coinbase team, like it's just too early. Are there some of these sort of sectors or verticals that you're personally excited about that might be a little bit too early for everyone else?
Yeah, I think, in terms of like sectors that I think not necessarily too early, because there have been builders like kind of working towards this, but we haven't necessarily found, the ideal solution. It's like things around DeFi that I think have been untapped. So like under collateralized lending, or unsecured credit and bringing that on chain. I think like that's an area that's like of interest. Some of the agentic commerce stuff, even though like you look at the data, yes, it's still early, but I do think like there is such like pent up demand, and how like agentic commerce dovetails into like kind of this personal AI agent phenomenon that's starting to happen. So I've been paying a lot of close attention to what's happening like in the OpenClaw and Hermes type of world, and thinking about, okay, what are the areas that crypto can play into, whether that's kind of privacy, or that's portability of like context and memory, and how like kind of blockchain can come into play. And so that's kind of like how we think about it. We play around with some of these tools ourselves. I have a Mac Mini, and my OpenClaw is running daily, and trying to trade on Hyperliquid at the moment. But we kind of like look at different like emerging spaces. We try to play around with some of the tools ourselves, and then reaching out to the founders to just kind of uncover like if this is an area that can have like long-term value capture potential.
And then would you say the RFPs that you guys put out is sort of a reverse engineer version of sort of this sort of thought process where it's just you guys in the trenches playing stuff out and then just putting stuff out like this? How successful is the RFP process for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, the RFP actually generates a ton of inbound, right? And so probably like most of our Q1, we put that out back in December. Most of our Q1 was just like fielding inbounds. And I always tell founders, like my DMs are always open. I'm reading those DMs. I'm trying to be as responsive as possible. And then we're scheduling calls and like blocking and tackling. And so luckily we've been able to kind of make several investments against those kind of sub theses that we put out. And so, I would call that a success. And you'll see more of that from Coinbase Ventures going forward as well.
That makes sense. Is there any sort of pointer in the RFP that has gotten the least amount of interest that you're most excited about, or something that's underserved by founders out there?
I wouldn't say like it is an area that's gotten the least amount of interest. I would say in terms of like the investment, it's probably like, I'm starting to take a look at like physical AI and robotics. And that's probably like in areas like, perhaps it is, not necessarily too early, because there's certainly a lot of activity in like more like the Web 2 sense, but thinking about where like the kind of more blockchain native, crypto native aspects come into play, and like what do like these true incentive networks actually evolve into. We had the pleasure of making one investment into OpenMind, now kind of Fabric protocol, so very excited there. But we also want to see what else is going to emerge out of that space. So that's probably the one area in that RFP that I'm eager to see what's going to evolve.
That makes sense. And then Jonathan, last question for you. The conversation till now has been amazing, and this is probably the toughest question for all the VCs that we've asked so far. Is there like a darling that you missed out on that's sort of come up, in multiple cycles? Is there like one missed deal that has kept you up at night?
I don't know if like there's probably like, yes, everyone has their anti list, and I don't know if like there's a specific project that I can recall, but I would say like there's sectors that maybe my thesis has changed, and probably one of them would be like decentralized training, in a sense. And reason because like, I was on the other side where I was like skeptical, like, can you actually train like these models in a more decentralized and distributed way? I have been very impressed by the progress I've seen made by those teams so far, and like how they're evolving their product suites to now build more like agentic systems. So to me, that's probably like an area that I'm going to start spending more time. I'm a little bit later to it, so obviously there will be a premium that comes with that, but it is an area that I think is kind of worth to revisit.
Awesome. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much. If I can just steal one more comment from you, do you have any
Sure.
advice for founders or anyone sort of looking to raise capital in the current environment? Like, what are some factors that you guys look into that would help them pitch to you guys better?
Yeah, I think like the founders that do well in terms of pitching to us, or just in general, is like the founders that not only they have like a strong grasp of the technology itself, and oftentimes in crypto you see a lot of like technically strong founders, but also they can blend the technicals with this is an actual business, and how am I going to drive value for this business? So being able to kind of create like a strong narrative between this is why this technology is, important. This is why it's differentiated. And this is how we're going to scale as a business and how we can drive like long-term demand and value capture. The founders that can navigate between both of those worlds tend to do pretty well on the fundraising circuit.
Awesome. This has been great, Jonathan. Thank you so much for the time. Well, I definitely want to turn this into like more of a quarterly thing or a half-yearly thing where we just get you back on, talk about the sectors that you're excited about. This conversation was amazing. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.